Buonasera a tutti, good evening and welcome to the Italian Radio Hour. Io sono Viviana and I would like to welcome back our regular listeners and also welcome any new listeners. Also be sure to like us on Instagram and Facebook at the Italian Radio Hour and subscribe to our YouTube channel to catch up on any past video interviews. Vorrei dare il benvenuto ai nostri ascoltatori da tutto il mondo, grazie per essere con noi anche oggi mentre continuiamo il nostro viaggio per l'Italia e la cultura italiana. Today's conversation topic is Hollywood's Italian-American filmmakers, Capra, Scorsese, Savoca, Coppola, and Tarantino, a wonderful publication written by Jonathan Cavallero. Jonathan is an associate professor and chair of Rhetoric, Film and Screen Studies at Bates College and the founding director of the Bates Film Festival. In this book, Jonathan explores the different ways in which Italian-American directors from the 1920s to the present have responded to their ethnicity. While some directors have used film to declare their ethnic roots and create an Italian-American imagined community, others have ignored or even denied their background. Ma prima, pubblicità. Parli italiano? Do you want to learn, improve, or master your Italian? Istituto Mondo Italiano can help. Located in the heart of Regent Square, Mondo Italiano offers small group classes and one-on-one private tutoring to help you learn Italian in no time. Visit us online at www.istitutomondoitaliano.org. The wait is over. I'm so excited to have John Cavallero with us. Benvenuto, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
It was not a long time ago that I actually was able to kind of join in one of your conversations about a movie that everyone is familiar with, Big Night, and where you already started to do some analysis on some of the stereotypes or some of the common themes in the Italian-American directors and movies. But before we really dig into the conversation, I would like for our audience to get to know you a little better. So with this beautiful last name, Cavallero, my question is, tell us a little bit about your family, where it's originally from, and anything you would like to share.
Yeah, sure. So my great-grandparents and my great-great-grandparents came to the U.S. in about 1910 on one side and 1913 on the other. My great-grandfather's family came from a town called Coppola, and my great-grandmother's family came from a town called Zungoli. And the story we were always told was that they met on the boat on the way over and fell in love. That's actually not true. It's a good myth. Not true.
They made for a good story, right?
Yeah, it did. So they settled in Dobbs Ferry, New York, and they were introduced by a mutual friend, and that's where the Cavallero family starts in America, right? So yeah, then my grandfather was one of I think 11 kids, 10 or 11 kids, and the family's gotten more dispersed and somewhat smaller, actually, as we've lost touch with our distant cousins, but it's still an important part of where I come from. I think it's an interesting thing because, like, genetically I'm only 25% Italian at this point, which makes me as Italian as Robert De Niro.
Well, that's going to be one of my questions, but keep on sharing your family story.
But I think culturally we're much more than 25% Italian. It was probably the most prominent influence growing up in the way I understood that side of my family. Was that was the Italian side, and when we would get together, it would be specific kinds of food. Italian words would get peppered into the conversation, or at least their remembrance of what those words mean. And so it was a big part of it growing up.
So I think it was, again, during that presentation you were doing about Big Night, as you were referring to one specific scene, with the starches and the potatoes and so forth. And I think you either relate that to your grandmother, or that made you think about your grandmother, and you got kind of the same reaction. Was she the instrumental or an instrumental person in, again, cultivating the Italianness in you?
Yeah, and she wasn't Italian.
Mm-hmm.
That's
So
the
she
interesting
would
thing.
have led to the rise and
She thought she was Italian, and she learned a lot because she married into an Italian American family, and so she wanted to be good at making Italian food. She wanted to understand her relatives, and she spent a lot of time, I think, cultivating those to the level of being an expert, and then that got passed on to me, in part through her. I mean, I knew my grandfather too, of course. But yeah, she outlived him by about 11 years, maybe 13 years, something like that. And so as I got older, I spent a lot more time with her, and I heard a lot more about the family through her. And I learned a lot more about the culture through her, even though she didn't have that genetic heritage.
This beautiful volume that you have recently published makes me wonder, did you have already some keen interest in movies growing up? And any specific type of movie, or is this something that you developed as you started to embrace your academic life?
Well, I loved movies growing up. My dad and I would go quite frequently to see films at the theater, and there are some of them that helped me to understand, like, or at least what I thought was my Italian heritage. But we can talk about that in a bit. But I think what happened is I went to college, and I needed to take an English course to fulfill a requirement, and they offered a film course, and I took that film course, and I fell in love with movies. And it wasn't until probably after that course had ended that I started to understand that that was actually something that you could do for a living. I came from a middle-class family in Philadelphia. We didn't have any connections to the entertainment industry, and for some reason it never occurred to me that filmmaking or film criticism, film history, teaching film could be a career that you would choose. And so that was something that I kind of came to realize, or grew to realize, as an undergraduate in college, and it just kind of took off from there. I saw in one of the classes, I remember I watched a Capra film. I think we watched Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and I had some prior knowledge of Capra, which I can't recall now. That was 20, 30 years ago now. But I was aware of the fact that he was Italian, and that was what interested me most about the film. And then the master's thesis on Capra grew out of that, and then the book grew out of the master's thesis. So that's how I came to it.
So before starting your analysis of the Italian American landscape, the industry, the film industry, in the and we'll talk a little bit, maybe we'll try to define something. Had you also spent time analyzing the Italian, some of the Italian directors? I mean, it seems to be that there is a lot of material on that. Or were you more interested in just focusing on to the Italian American landscape?
Most of my focus has been on the Italian American landscape. Increasingly, I've become more interested in Italian cinema, and I owe a lot of that to a professor I had when I was in my PhD program at Indiana, who's now passed away. His name's Peter Bondinella, and Peter was an expert on Fellini. And as a graduate student there at IU, I took probably 3 or 4 courses on Italian cinema with him. He was so well informed about the history of Italian cinema, and he actually had VHS tapes of films that aren't even available on DVD and weren't subtitled. And so I got to see a lot of films that were very rare as a result of Peter. And I had a lot of discussions about him, about Italian cinema, and that started to develop an understanding of the connections between Italian cinema and Italian American cinema.
Yeah, even because, then in the 60s, we have all these movies that are appealing also to the American audience back in Italy, because, again, Italy becomes a product as well. You have beautiful Roman holidays and many others where, Italy is the place where you want to be. Everything is romanticized, so, which are beautiful movies. And so when we talk about Italian American, and before you made a little remark that you are as Italian as Roberto De Niro, how do we define an Italian American movie, or at least where your criteria to define an Italian American movie or director?
Yeah, so that's an ongoing discussion, right? There's a guy named Robert Casillo who says Italian American films are films that treat Italian American subjects and are made by Italian American filmmakers. And I remember when I was getting ready to write my dissertation on Italian American directors, my advisor, a guy by the name of James Nairmore, read the proposal and said, "Just so you know, I don't know that an Italian American cinema exists." Which was really scary to have him say that. But what we settled on after talking about it was that there doesn't need to be a defined Italian American cinema for Italian American ethnicity to be an issue worth talking about in cinema, right? Mm-hmm. And eventually, like, where that's led me is, I don't fit into people's idea of stereotypical Italian Americanness. My connections to the culture were relegated to kind of memories and the occasional once or twice a year family meeting. I didn't grow up in an Italian American neighborhood. I don't speak Italian. I'm not Catholic. So there are a lot of ways that there are a lot of boxes that I don't check. Mm-hmm. And what I ended up realizing as I was studying these directors is that each of them had their own unique experience of what it meant to be Italian American. Mm-hmm. And so a big part of the project became expanding that definition and recognizing that there's not a way to be Italian American. There are ways to be Italian American. And some of those are externally defined and some of those are internally defined. And so a lot of the book and a lot of the project is about that, looking at directors that lived at different moments in American history, mm-hmm. Worked in different studio contexts, made different kinds of films, and yet all somehow identify with the culture.
Mm-hmm. So in your book, and then we will continue the conversation, you focus on Frank Capra, Martin Scorsese, Nancy Savoca, Francis Ford Coppola, and Quentin Tarantino. Was there anyone that almost made the cut, but it was time to kind of complete the project, or can we expect maybe a volume 2, pressure? And the search continues.
Yes, is the short
okay,
answer.
We're gonna
not the sequel book. I don't think that's happening. But there were a lot of directors who didn't make the cut and a lot of great films. And I mean, that was one of the easy things to say about the book when it came out was, why didn't he talk about De Palma? Why didn't he talk about
it's the same things also with travel shows, that someone covers one area and other people say, why didn't you go here? Why didn't you? Yeah. I mean, you have to limit it to the point where it's like, okay, there might be more material available.
Yeah, but I would have loved to have talked about, Minnelli. I would have loved to have talked about De Palma. I would have loved to have talked about Turturro. I really like his work mm-hmm. a lot. Stanley Tucci, who I've talked more about, Michael Correnti. There's mm-hmm. a lot of filmmakers that aren't as prominent as the ones I wrote about mm-hmm. that deserve attention. Mm-hmm. And along the way, I've picked up essays or whatnot, written essays about individual films, but I'm hoping somebody else will come along and write about them, because there are also directors that people don't think of as Italian who are, have an Italian American heritage. People like David O. Russell and Robert Zemeckis, and that is another area that has not gotten a lot of attention. So yes, absolutely. I hope. Maybe I will write another one.
Okay.
I don't know.
So some of the immigrant Italians felt prejudiced. Later generations positioned themselves in relation to their predecessor. And then we'll talk about how also the industry itself has kind of shaping up the perception of an Italian American character. So I think maybe we can do, I don't want to say an organized conversation, but the way that those directors are presented in the book, starting with Capra, and you said ethnic denial and its impossibility. That's the title of the chapter. Can you give us an overview, an overall overview of Capra, some of your observations, and again, how he positioned towards his heritage?
Yeah, so Capra was the most prominent filmmaker of the 1930s. Not only did he win 3 Best Director Academy Awards throughout the course of the decade, but he was also the president of the Motion Picture Academy and the Directors Guild of America at the same time. I tell my students now he was the Steven Spielberg of his day. He's a hugely prominent figure, and he was an Italian immigrant, and spent a lot of time addressing that, often saying that it wasn't an issue for him. There was a letter that a guy in Chicago by the name of Dominic Condoloro, who does similar kind of work, and he heard I was writing about Capra, and he sent me a letter in which he had written to Capra and invited him to an Italian American program to speak, and Capra had written back and said, I'm a 1090 Italian American, right? So that said, even if he was spending time denying that his ethnic heritage had any real influence on him, there were profiles being written of him in prominent magazines that were making a point of his Italianness, and often in a very stereotypical way. So I think it was a Collier's article in 1935. Capra had had a burst appendix when he was a kid, and he had survived it without going to the hospital. He didn't really know what it was. And that somehow came up in this article, and the writer attributed his survival to Sicilians have survived generations of knifings, and therefore he was genetically predisposed to survive this appendix. And it really upset Capra to the point that he wrote a pretty scathing letter to this guy, calling him out for that. When World War II started and Italian Americans were subjected to travel restrictions and curfews, his sister was targeted as a potential enemy alien while he was making movies for the U.S. Army, right? And talking about why we're fighting the war. So it was constantly an issue for him, even if he wanted to publicly say that it wasn't. And so that contrast between him wanting to find himself in a certain way, maybe for commercial purposes, right? Contrasted with the way that people continued to see him, even if he didn't want to be seen that way, was something that really drew me to him and to his work. That's
very interesting. For maybe every director, I might ask you to, if you don't mind, pinpoint some of the must-see. Our audience is both here and also in Italy and other countries, as far as Australia. So we want to give them some food for thought. For Capra, would you have some recommendations?
Absolutely. I mean, the prominent ones for Capra are, of course, It's a Wonderful Life. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, It Happened One Night. All very big, prominent films. He also won an Oscar for You Can't Take It With You. But I actually think that some of the lesser known films are, especially for this topic are pretty interesting. So he made a film in 1932 called American Madness, which was based on A.P. Giannini. Character is not Italian in the film, but it was based on that story. There's another one he made that's kind of hard to find called The Younger Generation, which is a 1929 silent-ish movie. I think it has some talking in it. I haven't watched it in a while. But it's about Jewish immigrants living on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And I think that there are some interesting parallels there between Capra's own experience and the sense of community he felt with other immigrant groups.
Moving on to Martin Scorsese, his Italian is a blessing or a curse?
You should have him on. I don't know. Yeah, Scorsese is interesting, right? Like, and what's really interesting about him is, so I wrote this book like 12 years ago now, and what's interesting about writing a book is that it kind of captures your thinking in that moment, and then you kind of have to answer for that, right, for the rest of your life. So what's happened with Scorsese that's interesting is he's gone on to make more films, and his career has evolved, not unlike Tarantino, right? So I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, here's the thing: like early on in his career, Italian Americanness was one of the things that made him an outsider and made his work stand out. It was something that was new. I mean, he made Mean Streets about a year after The Godfather, right? And it was a very different take on Italian Americanness and Italian American crime than Francis Ford Coppola had offered in The Godfather. But it also was so it was something that gave him kind of an edge, but it was also something that kept him on the margins. He was offering like an independent perspective that didn't fit neatly within the Hollywood style of filmmaking, right? But now it's hard to think of Martin Scorsese as marginalized at all. You know, he's a guy that's trusted with $100 million budgets and has been making big films with big stars for big studios for a long time. And so I think what's happened is like the meaning of Italian American ethnicity has changed over the last 50 years. And he is not nearly as marginalized as he once was back in the 70s. And so, yeah, when I wrote that chapter, you know, his sense of using that as a sense of belonging and also something that kept him outside the industry may now have changed to the point that it's still something about belonging, but it's not necessarily marginalizing him in the way that it once did.
And also with Scorsese, you know, we're not just talking about movies, we're also talking about documentaries, right?
Right.
So in the Neighborhood and also in the Italian American Contribution, where there is that nostalgic approach.
Absolutely. Yeah. So and I'm actually I'm in the process of revising a chapter now on his television work. So his television work has been marginalized from discussions of his career because television directors aren't typically seen as having the power of television writers and producers. And yet throughout his career, he's done some really interesting television work, and he's worked in television every decade of his career since the 70s. He's directed since 2000. He's directed more TV than he has feature-length films. And I find some of that stuff to be among his most interesting work. So not just Italian American from 1974, which is a documentary about his parents that he made. And he's called that I think he called it the best film he's ever made. But the stuff that he did with Boardwalk Empire and Vinyl and Martin Scorsese Presents the Blues, really they're really interesting films, and for me they engage race in a way that some of his other work hasn't yet. And so yeah, I hope that the television work isn't marginalized from his discussion. But yeah, The Neighborhood's a great one. and Italian American's a great one from his work. And of course, his films, you know, the ones I would star are Raging Bull and Mean Streets and Goodfellas. More recently, people have really liked The Departed and Wolf of Wall Street. He's got a new film coming out called Killers of the Flower Moon this year, which is supposed to be remarkable. From everybody I know that's seen it, they've loved it. I haven't been able to yet. Hopefully soon they'll release that, and then I will. And then I'd also star, he made a film called My Voyage to Italy, which is a 4-hour documentary about Italian cinema. And it's a companion piece to, he did one on American movies called A Personal Journey Through American Movies with Martin Scorsese. And the Italian one is just, it's great. It's so good. And it introduces so many films, and not just that, but he's found like pristine copies of them, so they look beautiful, even on a DVD. So yeah.
With Martin Scorsese, you also talk about his approach towards the young Italian American man. You talk about La Bella Figura and everything. So can you give us a description of what he was after with maybe with Mean Streets?
Yeah. So this actually might play into Savoca too, Nancy Savoca's work. So
maybe we can tie both.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a nice little bridge between those two chapters. So I'm blanking on the name. I shouldn't, but anyway, La Bella Figura. There's a book, right? That's written.
Oh yes, yeah. Is it the one by Beppe Severnini, or is it a different one? There are a couple of these times. I think I know which one. If it is not the one by Beppe Severnini, I might.
Yeah. So it's the idea of, like, you know, making a good face, like having a good.
Not embarrassing yourself, right? So it's showing up in a certain decor and so forth.
So what you see in Mean Streets with Charlie, he's the character played by Harvey Keitel, and he's kind of a stand-in for Scorsese. In fact, Scorsese provides the voiceover for the character, even though Keitel is the actor, at least at the beginning. And Charlie, like, has all these things he wants to do. He has all these thoughts he has in his head, but he's constantly filtering them through what his culture would find acceptable, or what he thinks his culture would find acceptable. And that desire to kind of create the public image he wants for himself is his defining feature in a lot of ways, as far as I'm concerned. So what that means is that often this character is making choices for other people and not himself, right? And he feels somewhat confined by that, but it's also what defines him as a character.
Yeah. So then moving on to Nancy Savoca, you have, tell us a little bit about films like True Love and House of Saints, because now it's more concentrated on female Italian American characters. So now we have an additional element to focus on.
Yeah, and actually the person that wrote that book, I just remember, was Gloria Nardini.
Oh, okay, so it is the other one, yes.
So Nancy, she's a very interesting figure, right? Like, so her family is Argentine, Italian, American, right? And they have a very interesting history. And she was the one who was born in the States, but has ended up, traveling the world, and she's a very remarkable filmmaker. And she makes True Love in 1989. It wins the U.S. Film Festival, which is the Sundance Film Festival. That's what it was called at the time. And it was actually the huge year for Sundance. It was the year that Sundance became what it is now, and it's actually going on right now, which is good timing. But Nancy won that award over Steven Soderbergh film called Sex, Lies, and Videotape. And it's a great little movie about this couple who are engaged to be married and probably don't really love each other, but still feel the need or the pressure to commit to a marriage with one another. And it's what I find remarkable about it is that my students are often quick to judge the character that Annabella Sciorra plays.
Donna.
Donna, right. And say, oh, she's making a mistake, this and that and the other thing. And what's interesting about that is that Donna comes from a working class background, and she lives in this neighborhood where everybody knows each other. Everybody's friends with each other. And she realized she's not, a dumb character. Like she understands the dynamics of her relationship. But she makes a choice that for her life, this is the better choice to make, because walking away from this relationship would mean sacrificing quite a lot in her life, many relationships, her home. So it's the best choice for her, and it puts her in a more powerful position. And so her outlook is very much tied to her, not just her ethnic background, but her social class background. And I think that's a defining feature of a lot of Nancy's work. Dogfight in particular, it's probably my favorite of her films. Definitely like focuses on that aspect of the character's identity.
Trying to find probably her own place in society again, between who she is and the values that she will embrace or not. So
but smart enough to kind of understand the lay of the land, right? And smart enough to balance whatever her personal emotions are with the realities of the consequences of her choices, And so it becomes harder, I think, for my students, many of whom come from very privileged backgrounds. It's a moment where they start to realize just how far that privilege goes for them, and the kinds of things they do not need to consider that character and other people in her situation have to.
We are turning page completely. We are getting to Francis Ford Coppola, and so here, I will invite you to do an analysis, of his work, and maybe not only about the Godfather trilogy, but how those characters became eventually the expectation of what an Italian American is all about: temper, mafia, killing people, broken relationships, or maybe having a full marriage and then others. So, but let's talk about Francis Ford Coppola in your own words.
So Coppola is interesting because unlike Scorsese, unlike Capra, unlike Savoca, he did not come from a working class background. He came from a middle class background. His father was a famous musician, and instead of being something that marginalized him, my sense is that it was something that made him feel unique, that he had this Italian background, this connection to what he saw as a very artistic history and legacy that he was connected to. And so his celebration of Italian American ethnicity, which I think The Godfather is, despite the use of gangsters, and I'm thinking specifically of the wedding sequence at the beginning of that film, became something that he's able to embrace. And so The Godfather is maybe the most romantic representation of Italian American ethnicity out there. It's a celebration of Italian American ethnicity. It's not something that makes these characters, I don't know, vulnerable. It's something that makes them strong. And so that's what I became interested in, and that was his nostalgic embrace of Italian American culture, you know, and what that means. And I think one of the things that's interesting about the stereotypes is, you know, of course, The Godfather, The Sopranos, Goodfellas, right, have Italian American stereotypes in them, right? It's hard to argue that the Italian American gangster isn't a stereotype, and it's hard to argue that that's not present in the films. They are, right? But I think what's interesting is that as the history of the U.S. has evolved, and as Italians have become more assimilated, the ability of that stereotype to marginalize Italian Americans, I think, has weakened. So it's not like when my grandfather was a kid and Scarface and Little Caesar were coming out and people were looking at Italians as like this threat that needed to be deported in order to save the country from the Great Depression, right? Which they were. It's now seen as something different, right? Yeah, we have Italian gangster stereotypes, but you know, Michael Imperioli is one of the actors from The Sopranos, and now White Lotus. Said, you know, I just don't think that like some kid's not getting into college because the dean sees that he's an Italian American and they think his family's gangsters, you know. And so I think that's what's interesting about it. And the Godfather, I think, played a role in evolving that, right? So that the point that like in the 30s, you watch those films and you didn't want to be like the gangsters. I think in the 70s, a lot of people watched those films, and for whatever reason, and this is problematic to say the least, but they wanted to be like the Corleones, right? That's different, right? And I think one of the things that, you know, becomes interesting is that I think Coppola starts to feel like he was critiquing, especially Michael, and that audiences weren't getting it. And he spent a lot of time in part 2 and in part 3, I think, trying to undermine the myth that he had created in part 1.
Yeah. So yeah, it's very interesting because, as I said, in the industries, it's a beautiful, obviously, piece of a beautiful trilogy. Some of the stereotypes getting really ingrained now, because that was the intent, the original intent of that specific director, is because the industry, being a commercial one, sees what sells and what doesn't sell, and therefore some of the stereotypes have also been pushed through the last so many years, also with other series, because they found that there was an audience for it. So there's some people that might obviously get offended by that and said, but we're not like that. And others, they say, well, there are certain elements, and then there is Hollywood. Okay, so let's can we talk about a little bit of the relationship between Puzo's novel versus Coppola films, and were they
and let me just circle back to, I mean, I think one of the things that you know, to the folks who are offended by it, it's right that the representation of Italian Americanness hasn't changed very much in since the 30s, right, or even before. So like for over 100 years, the representation of Italian Americanness has stayed relatively the same, and that's troubling. It's absolutely troubling. And it is the perpetuation of a stereotype. And so if we're looking at the text and we're seeing that, yeah, absolutely, right, that's problematic. I think if we ask, like, what can this stereotype achieve, right, that has changed in the last 100 years. So you've got this weird combination of the cultural context and the text, and how much does a changing cultural context influence the meaning or the power of a text? And I think that's where a lot of that debate centers, right? And it's a good debate, because there's not an easy question or an easy answer to that, I don't think. Uh,
Um,
go ahead.
No, I just as I said, obviously there are huge names in the Italian American community. From the scientists, Anthony
Yeah,
Fauci.
yeah. Pelosi,
So it just, as I said, it's just kind of,
Alito.
you said you have to kind of split between the entertainment factor and truth and means. I mean, there is some sort of foundation, but as all the civiltà, all the societies evolve. But anyway,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, no, it's an interesting, like really interesting discussion. And it's actually, when I teach this subject, that's where we spend a lot of our time. It's like,
Mhm.
what do you value more?
Yeah.
Can the meaning of a text change? And we spend a lot of time debating that, because I think I hope we're all constantly learning from that.
Yeah.
I certainly am.
Yeah.
So the novel of The Godfather, when it was adapted, became kind of an issue, right? Because if you read the Godfather novel, the characters are not as romantic as Coppola makes them out to be, right? Particularly the character of Luca Brasi, which is one of the characters I focus on in that book. So Brasi is like this awful character in the novel who who Vito sends out to do some of the most gruesome work he has.
Mhm.
He murders Capone henchmen by hacking their limbs off. He becomes a father with his girlfriend, and she's Irish, and he throws the baby into a furnace or makes somebody else do it, and then kills the mother. He's not a good guy in the least. He's a very awful character, and the Don keeps him very close to him, right? And that creates, I think, a different impression of Vito as well. Who is this person that would keep somebody like that close to him as one of his more trusted associates? And when Coppola made the film, of course, Brasi becomes this guy who fumbles over his words in front of Vito, and has like a pretty short lifespan, and you never see him do anything evil. He goes to like supposedly betray Vito, and he's found out and made to sleep with the fishes, right? And that's the end of his storyline. And so when the film was made, Coppola was involved in the writing of the film, but he often referred to the film as Coppola's. I mean, Puzo was involved in the writing of the film, but he also often referred to it as Coppola's film, because he said that Coppola had softened the characters and made them too nice, right? And some of that is, I think, the desire of Coppola to make it kind of a romantic representation of Italian American ethnicity, and part of that was that the film had to go before a ratings board, and the kinds of things that Brasi did in the novel would have gotten the film an X rating in the 70s, and that would have meant that they wouldn't have been able to sell tickets because it wouldn't have played at many theaters, and it certainly wouldn't have won Best Picture and done all the other things it did. So yeah, it's an interesting adaptation, and he used they used the parts of the novel some of the parts of the novel that they didn't have in the first movie for the second movie. Yeah. And they actually were planning a part 4 to that film. And I'm not sure how much of that would have come from the novel, but the idea was to do something like part 2, where in part 2 you have Michael and you have Vito, and the film cuts back and forth between them at about the same age. So you get to see how father and son dealt with similar issues at a similar time in their life. And they wanted to do something like that with Vito's rise to power, and then Andy Garcia's characters taking the family into the drug business. So you would have seen some of the brutality of Vito, some of the brutality of Brasi, and then you would have seen how that turned into like the decimation of the family as they moved into drugs and whatnot. But Puzo died while they were thinking about that, and once he was gone, Coppola said he never would do it.
Just one little, by reading through your pages, some of the pictures that were used, they were not actually shot in New York Harbor, but in Trieste. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's part two, right? Like the Ellis Island arrival was shot in Italy. It wasn't shot in the US, right? And they've got and actually it's they were kind enough to use that image on the cover of Vito looking out at the Statue of Liberty, but that was shot in Italy.
Yeah.
So the reflection is really an illusion.
Yeah.
So it was a really interesting choice, showing how constructed those nostalgic moments can actually be.
Indeed, as I think you're saying, characterize Italian American ethnicity or as artificial as these images as well.
It can be, yeah.
So we're moving into the 90s. So here we go, Quentin Tarantino, who is from more like a mixed ethnic background, and it was interesting when he was interviewed by Playboy, asked what is the difference between a New York Italian and a Los Angeles Italian and he responded, sorry if I quoted with my thick accent, there really is no such thing as a Los Angeles Italian. In New York, there are Italian neighborhoods. In Los Angeles, there aren't. There is no ethnicity here. You just are who you are. Of course, most of the Italian stuff here is learned from movies like Mean Streets anyway. And and then you go on saying that Tarantino's willingness to frame Italian ethnicity as an empty signifier is obviously coming across not only from this statement, but so tell us, we're now in the 90s, we have Pulp Fiction. Where does Tarantino fall under?
Tarantino, so it's important to note that he was born in Knoxville, Tennessee. His father's name is Tony Tarantino. As far as I know, and certainly by the time that book came out, he had never met his Italian American father and had no interest in meeting him. His mother was part Cherokee, and he lived in various neighborhoods around Los Angeles. So he's marked with that Italian name, but he has no real connection to a neighborhood, to a family, to a father of Italian American descent. And so that's kind of where that chapter came from, is like, well, can we really refer to him as an Italian American artist? And he does quote a lot of Italian American films, right? And Italian films, in fact. I mean, like Kill Bill Volume 2, a lot of the spaghetti westerns, Leone, he's a big filmmaker that he's interested in. And so, I mean, like a lot of his understanding of ethnicity comes through this performative space, and in a lot of ways that is problematic, as we were talking about the stereotypes. Like, what does it mean if suddenly, those representations become what of your ethnic background, and that's how you identify with it, and when you perform that identity, that's what you think of as Italian American. And so he's an interesting case in that way. I don't think that he would be particularly I don't know that he would think that he belonged in the book, frankly. I think he would say, that's not really me.
It's also to create contrast.
But I do think that is a main way that we, that later generations, including myself, have come to understand Italian Americanness. Like we don't have a lot of Italian American classmates in school, but we hear about Italian American culture through the media, and so the media becomes our way of kind of understanding what it means. And increasingly, as my grandparents are gone, my dad's in his 70s now. My aunt's older than him. You know, and my kids, they're going to learn about it a little bit from me. But you know, I learned a lot of it, some of it at least, from movies and TV shows, right? So it's kind of a strange thing. There's an Italian American scholar by the name of Tom Ferraro wrote a book called Feeling Italian, and he talks about how, you know, the ability to feel Italian through a media text has brought real Italian Americans who have genetic, ethnic, cultural heritage, whatever, closer to people who don't, right? And that what it means now in this era to be Italian American has fundamentally changed.
So your final thoughts, conclusions, and how much do you follow new directors in these days? In different genre we did in the Italian cinema.
I mean, I'm starting to work on a project on the 90s now, and there are a lot of filmmakers from that decade who are making films about Italian Americans who were Italian American that don't get a lot of attention. And I think that's what I continue to be interested in as a writer, is looking at how we can expand this understanding of Italian Americanness, and what that means when we do that. Right? It's an interesting thing to talk about ethnic communities, because on some level, in order to define them, you have to exclude people, right? You're not Italian. This person is Italian. You can't claim Italianness because of whatever reason, right? And if you open up the gates and everybody can claim Italianness, then that's a different thing, which I'm intrigued by. I think that's actually a really interesting move to make. But I'm constantly interested in like how we imagine this community, and how various people's imagination of Italian Americans, whether they be insiders or outsiders in that group, are used to leverage, whatever goals they're trying to achieve, be they political, economic, social, etc. So I think that continues to be an interest, and I can't imagine a time when that won't be the case, right? I can't imagine a time when it just wouldn't matter. I think it will always be that way.
Yeah, indeed. It is always it's a fluid conversation. It cannot really be framed from point A to point B, even because that conversation is relevant to the historical time, to the factors that affect that conversation. And also, as you said, how that conversation is utilized for other purposes. But I have to say that our conversation was indeed great. Thank you so very much for your insight and your analysis. Again, I recommend Hollywood's Italian American Filmmakers. Jonathan does a wonderful job, and I hope that among all the Italian American Studies conferences throughout the US, we'll have a chance to meet in person. But for now, unfortunately, our hour is up. And il Big Ben ha detto stop. It's time for us to say arrivederci e alla prossima. We want to thank you for tuning in to the program. If you have any questions or comments, or if you have any trouble topics you would like us to address, please contact us at theitalianradiohour@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. And remember, if you or any of your family and friends have missed a prior episode or would like to listen to this episode again, please visit our website at www.istitutomondoitaliano.org and click on the Italian Radio Hour tab. And you can also find our video interviews on the Italian Radio Hour YouTube channel, or you can listen to the conversation on wherever you catch your favorite podcasts. We would like to thank our guest, John Cavallero, and our sponsor, Istituto Mondo Italiano, and Alla Boara for the music. Until next time, alla prossima. Ciao, ciao.